March 3, 1943. 04 modern 17 hours. The North Atlantic. The sea was black, a cold, breathing void stretching endlessly beneath a ceiling of low cloud. On the corvette HMCS Snowberry, Lieutenant Arthur MacLeod stood on the bridge with his collar pulled high against the wind. Ice glazed the rails and the smell of diesel mixed with salt and steel. Behind him, the men of the Royal Canadian Navy were awake, young, undertrained, under-equipped, but alive with a tension that made their hands tremble over depth-charge levers. To the German command in Berlin, they were a joke. Farm boys with toy ships, Admiral Donitz had once sneered. Yet on this night, the laughter had stopped. A convoy had gone silent, and somewhere out there, a wolf pack had begun to vanish. The first report had come 2 days earlier from a Liberator bomber patrolling east of St. John's. A slick of oil, a patch of debris, and no survivors. Then another, an explosion seen at dawn. No radio contact, no distress call. 3 U-boats lost in 72 hours. The Kriegsmarine called it coincidence. Donitz called it sabotage. But men like MacLeod, with their faces burned by sea wind and sleeplessness, knew it was something else. The Canadians were learning, fast, brutally, and in silence. At 04:23, a faint blip flickered on the ASDIC screen. The operator's voice cracked the night. "Contact bearing 245, range 1,200 yards, sir." MacLeod didn't speak. He only nodded, his hand tightening on the cold metal railing. The engines hummed low. Somewhere beneath them, a German submarine was gliding through the dark, unaware that the greenhorns above had changed the rules of the hunt. The Snowberry turned into the wind, its propellers thrumming like a heartbeat. Orders whispered down the deck. Men moved with precision born not of training, but of instinct carved by fear. When the depth charges dropped, they fell with the solemn rhythm of bells. The sea swallowed them whole. Then seconds later, the Atlantic erupted. A column of water and flame shot into the sky, and a vibration tore through the hull. The men cheered, but MacLeod didn't. He watched the boiling sea with the calm of someone who knew what killing in the dark truly meant. For him, it wasn't victory. It was confirmation that their enemy now bled in the same water they did. Canada's Navy had been mocked since the war began. In 1939, it had fewer than a dozen operational warships, most of them aging relics from the First World War. The sailors were farmers, fishermen, mechanics, men who had never seen the open ocean. They trained in borrowed boats, sailed with maps that still bore pencil marks from British hands. Yet by 1943, they were holding one of the most perilous lifelines of the war, the North Atlantic convoy routes, the fragile arteries feeding Britain's survival. Every barrel of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every sack of flour crossed a killing ground, and the men who guarded it did so in vessels built in Halifax shipyards, often from scrap, painted in haste, and blessed only by grit. The Snowberry belonged to the flower class, small, slow, and perpetually wet. The men called them the buckets. They rolled violently in rough seas, their decks constantly awash, their bunks damp with salt. Yet in these fragile hulls, the Canadians began rewriting the art of anti-submarine warfare. They experimented with convoy spacing, used crude radar sets scavenged from downed aircraft, and coordinated with coastal aircraft through coded flares when radios failed. They didn't follow the manual. They improvised, and somewhere in that improvisation something started to work. Berlin didn't understand. Intelligence reports from captured survivors spoke of ghost ships, corvettes that appeared without warning, depth-charged with uncanny precision, then vanished into fog. The German press mocked it as Allied propaganda, but Donitz wasn't laughing anymore. In the corridors of the Kriegsmarine headquarters, a quiet panic began to spread. Submarine captains started reporting phantom interference on sonar, distorted echoes, and false readings. Some blamed British technology. Others believed the Canadians had developed a new kind of hydrophone. The truth was simpler and stranger. It was the sea itself, reshaped by those who had learned to read it. MacLeod had grown up in Nova Scotia, the son of a shipwright. He knew how the Atlantic spoke, its moods, its rhythms, its deceptive calm. He trained his men not by the book, but by the weather, by instinct, by silence. "You don't find a U-boat," he'd say. "You feel where it doesn't belong." And somehow that strange intuition worked. Convoys under Canadian escort started losing fewer ships. The Germans began losing more. What began as a mockery became a myth. A small, stubborn fleet of men who fought not with technology, but with tenacity. At dawn, the wind shifted. The sea calmed, turning to molten silver under a bleeding sky. The Snowberry moved through the wreckage of what had been U-214. The air smelled of oil and burnt cordite. Pieces of blackened rubber and twisted steel floated like the bones of a mechanical beast. On the surface, nothing human remained, only fragments of a periscope, a torn glove, a page from a logbook, written in German, and smeared with salt. MacLeod ordered the engines to idle. He stood on the bow, eyes fixed on the horizon. He knew men had died down there, men who hours before had mocked his country in their coded transmissions. Now the Atlantic had taken them, and it made no distinction between flag or uniform. For a moment, silence reigned. Only the slow creak of the ship and the distant cry of gulls broke the stillness. Then MacLeod turned and walked below deck. There was no celebration, just the routine of survival, hot tea, a cigarette, and the endless cold. But somewhere deep inside, something had shifted. They were no longer the forgotten navy of the Commonwealth. They were something else now, a force born from obscurity, shaped by storms, and baptized by salt. As the day wore on, word of the sinking spread through the convoy like static. Other captains radioed their congratulations in clipped Morse tones. MacLeod ignored most of them. He stared at the chart table, at the zigzag lines tracing their path toward Britain, each mark a gamble against fate. He knew the Germans would come again, angrier, more desperate, but that didn't matter. The sea had taught him patience, and patience was deadlier than rage. In Berlin, the reports continued to arrive. U-231, lost without trace. U-377, presumed sunk. U-625, last contact north of Ireland, gone. Units ordered an inquiry. Some officers whispered that the Canadians had received British sonar prototypes. Others, that they had captured a U-boat and reverse-engineered its systems. None of it was true. The truth was far less glamorous. It was discipline forged in monotony, courage built from repetition, and a willingness to learn from every death. The kind of innovation that never made it into textbooks. By the end of that month, Canadian escort groups had destroyed or crippled more submarines than any other Allied fleet in the North Atlantic. Their success baffled analysts. It wasn't science, it was survival turned into strategy. The men of the Snowberry, the Sackville, and the Chilliwack didn't think of themselves as heroes. They thought of themselves as stubborn, and that, perhaps, was their greatest weapon. That night, as darkness returned and the convoy pressed onward, MacLeod walked the deck alone. The stars were out, faint, trembling against the vast emptiness above. Somewhere out there, another U-boat stalked them, another captain listening through the static for a sound, a pulse, a heartbeat in the water. But the ocean was vast, and the Canadians had learned how to vanish into it. They didn't hunt with arrogance, they hunted with silence. And in that silence, the war at sea began to turn. The storm hit 2 nights later, a wall of black water rising from the horizon like a living thing. On board HMCS Snowberry, every seam groaned, every bolt seemed to pray. The ship was built to chase submarines, not to survive the fury of the North Atlantic. The men tied themselves to rails, their faces pale under the ghostly green light of the bridge. The ocean screamed against the hull, the bow plunging into darkness before climbing again through mountains of water that shattered across the deck. Lieutenant Arthur MacLeod shouted orders through the wind, his voice torn by the storm. Beneath his boots, he could feel the ship flex alive and defiant, the heartbeat of Canada's forgotten fleet. Out here, no one was a hero. They were only survivors. The war had become something vast and indifferent, a struggle against the elements as much as the enemy. The Germans called the North Atlantic Die Graue Hölle, the gray hell. But it was here, in this desolate crucible of salt and steel, that the Canadians were forged into something Berlin could neither understand nor replicate. Their strength wasn't in numbers nor in weapons. It was in endurance, the kind that came from generations who had lived by the ocean, mending nets, building boats, and reading storms like scripture. By dawn, the storm broke. The sea flattened into a cold silence and fog crept in from the east, thick as smoke. The men moved like ghosts through it, faces chapped and raw. Somewhere in that fog, a U-boat might be crawling beneath them, its crew just as exhausted, just as afraid. MacLeod leaned over the map table, tracing the convoy's position. They were 300 miles south of Iceland, deep within the hunting grounds of Wolfpack Shill. Intelligence said there were at least 7 submarines in the area, but since the last attack, none had made contact. None had even been heard. They were there, and yet they weren't. It was as if the ocean had swallowed them whole. At 0930, a signal crackled through the wireless. A distress call, faint, distant, quickly cut off. Convoy HX-229 under attack, coordinates unknown. MacLeod ordered flank speed. The Snowberry and two other escorts broke formation, their engines pounding as they carved through the fog. Hours later, they found nothing but silence and oil. No ships, no survivors, no wreckage. Just a dark sheen spreading across the waves, smelling of iron and fuel. The men stood at the rail in silence. Some spat into the sea, others crossed themselves. MacLeod said nothing. He just watched the horizon the way one might watch a graveyard. Back in Berlin, Admiral Donitz had grown restless. Reports from the Atlantic made no sense. Some U-boats had vanished mid-transmission, their coordinates never updated. Others had surfaced unexpectedly, crews shaken, reporting sonar illusions and mechanical malfunctions. In one intercepted message, a captain described hearing ship propellers from nowhere moments before his sonar went dead. Donitz suspected a new British weapon, perhaps magnetic interference or radio deception. He ordered countermeasures, but they achieved nothing. The truth, hidden within the fog and the silence, was far more mundane and far more terrifying. The Canadians had learned to fight the invisible war better than anyone. They didn't have cutting-edge technology. Their ASDIC sets were unreliable, their depth charges imprecise, but they had begun experimenting with something no manual had ever taught: acoustic deception. By dragging noisemakers behind their ships, crude assemblies of pipes and gears built in Halifax workshops, they created false propeller signatures that confused U-boat operators. German captains began chasing phantoms while real convoys slipped by unnoticed. When the submarines surfaced to fix their bearings, they were often met not by cargo ships but by corvettes armed and waiting. In less than a month, 6 U-boats were destroyed this way. None of it was official doctrine. It was improvisation turned into strategy, warfare by intuition. MacLeod's men were the perfect instruments for it. They didn't think like officers, they thought like fishermen. They felt the water. They could sense when something was wrong with the current, when the air carried the faint vibration of an unseen engine. They trusted the silence as much as they trusted the sound. For them, the sea wasn't just a battlefield, it was an organism, alive and listening. And in learning to read it, they had become something more than sailors. They had become interpreters of the abyss. When dusk fell, the fog lifted, revealing the faint outline of another escort ship on the horizon. HMCS Sackville. She was Canada's pride, a corvette as battered as the men who served on her. Her captain, Lieutenant Commander Alan Easton, was an old acquaintance of MacLeod's, a man of dry humor and unshakable calm. Over the radio, their voices carried through static. "Arthur," Easton said, "you still chasing ghosts?" "Only the ones that bleed oil," MacLeod replied. Their laughter crackled through the interference, brief, human, absurd in its normalcy. Moments like that kept them sane. Beneath the jokes, they both knew what the statistics refused to say aloud. The North Atlantic was a graveyard, and every crossing was a gamble. But for the first time since the war began, the odds were shifting. The U-boats, once hunters, were now being hunted. That night, as the Snowberry drifted silently through the calm, the ASDIC operator leaned forward, eyes wide. A faint echo, irregular but real, pulsed across the screen. Range 900 yards, depth uncertain. MacLeod gave no order at first. He only listened. To the sea, to the hum of the engines, to the slow, almost imperceptible vibration in the hull. Then, quietly, he said, "Hard to port. Ready charges." The deck came alive. Men moved with the precision of habit. The first pattern of charges dropped. 6 cylinders sinking into darkness. The explosions rolled through the water low and heavy. Then came another pattern, closer this time. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then a sound unlike anything else. The hollow crack of collapsing steel deep beneath the waves. Oil rose to the surface, spreading in thin, glistening ribbons under the moonlight. The crew cheered. MacLeod didn't. He just watched, his face lit by the dull glow of the horizon. Another ghost gone. Another name that would never make it home. The war at sea had no front lines, no cities to capture. It was fought in currents, in silence, in the unseen geometry of sound. Every victory was invisible, every death too. That was its cruelty, and its mystery. When word reached London of the Canadians' growing success, it was met with cautious disbelief. Reports from Allied intelligence confirmed that U-boat losses in the Western Atlantic had doubled in 3 months. The Admiralty credited new radar sets, improved coordination, and luck. Few mentioned the men of the Snowberry and her sister ships, Fewer still understood what they were doing differently. The Canadians didn't care. Recognition wasn't their fuel. Duty was. In one of his rare letters home, MacLeod wrote to his wife in Halifax, "The sea is a strange teacher. It doesn't shout, it waits. And if you survive long enough, it starts showing you what it knows." He didn't mention the men who froze to death on deck, or the faces of the Germans they sometimes found drifting among the wreckage. He didn't mention how, in the quiet hours before dawn, he sometimes felt sorry for them. He just wrote about the weather, about the fog, about the endless horizon, because the truth was too heavy to fit between the lines. By the spring of 1943, Donitz's wolf packs were breaking apart. The Atlantic had turned hostile to them. Radios failed, escorts appeared from nowhere, convoys arrived intact. For the first time, the hunters were afraid. In intercepted transmissions, German captains described the Canadian escorts with a kind of awe. Small ships that strike like lightning and vanish like smoke. The Kriegsmarine tried to adapt, but it was too late. The tide had turned. The Battle of the Atlantic, the longest campaign of the war, was slipping away from them, and much of it had been decided not in London or Washington, but in the freezing silence off the coast of Newfoundland. One night long after the last flare had faded and the convoy slept under a blanket of stars, MacLeod walked alone to the bow. The sea was calm again, indifferent, endless. He thought about the men he'd lost, and the men he'd sunk. In the dark, it all seemed the same. The war had taken so much that it was hard to tell where victory ended and guilt began. He lit a cigarette, cupped it against the wind, and watched the ember glow faintly against the night. Somewhere out there, he thought, another U-boat was waiting. Or maybe it wasn't. Maybe the ocean had finally taken them all. And in that thought, quiet, haunting, almost tender, he found the cruel symmetry of it all. The Germans had called them amateurs, but amateurs had learned to master the sea. And the sea, in its cold and impartial way, had returned the favor. May 1943. The North Atlantic was no longer the same battlefield it had been at the start of the war. The winter gales had subsided, leaving behind a colder, quieter menace. The kind that comes not from waves or weather, but from waiting. Convoy ONS-5, 42 merchant ships bound for Liverpool, crawled eastward through a corridor of mist and uncertainty. Around them moved 5 Canadian escorts, the HMCS Snowberry, Sackville, Drumheller, Chilliwack, and Dauphin. Small, weather-beaten vessels, their paint peeling, their decks scarred, yet their presence had begun to cast a long shadow across the Atlantic. Lieutenant Arthur MacLeod leaned over the bridge railing, binoculars pressed against his face, scanning the horizon. His eyes were dry from lack of sleep, his skin drawn tight by the wind. Every sound mattered. The pitch of the engines, the murmur of the radio, the low thrum of the sea against steel. The convoy stretched behind him like a fragile necklace of lights. Tankers, freighters, and colliers, each carrying something the war could not continue without. If the Germans broke through tonight, dozens of men would drown in oil and fire. Yet for now, the sea was still, deceptively peaceful, the kind of calm that made even veterans uneasy. Far beneath that calm, at a depth of 90 meters, the enemy was listening. Captain Lieutenant Walter Kessler of U-438 adjusted his hydrophone, straining to separate the convoy's hum from the static of the ocean. He had been at sea for 4 weeks, and his crew was exhausted. Diesel fumes filled the air, the smell of sweat and machinery blending into something heavy, almost metallic. He'd heard stories of vanished U-boats, comrades who sent their last transmission before dissolving into silence. Some said the British had new technology. Others whispered that the Canadians had developed a sonar weapon that could see through fog. Kessler didn't believe in ghosts, but even disbelief had begun to feel thin. On the Snowberry, the Aztec operator stiffened. Contact. Faint. Port bow. Range 2,000 yards. MacLeod didn't look up. Hold bearing, he said quietly. Let him come to us. He had learned patience from the sea. The Germans, proud and aggressive, were hunters by nature. But MacLeod had discovered that in these waters patience was deadlier than pursuit. He watched the seconds bleed away, listening to the hum of the ship's heart. Then he gave the order. Engines half ahead. Prepare depth pattern 2. The corvette swung slowly, her stern aligning with the unseen predator below. The sea hissed as the depth charges rolled off their racks. 1, 2, 3, sinking into blackness. Moments later, the Atlantic convulsed. The explosions echoed across the fog, low and distant, like thunder rolling through the deep. Then came the telltale bloom of oil on the surface, dark and spreading. The crew cheered, but MacLeod's expression didn't change. He knew what it meant. Another ghost added to the sea's memory. In Berlin, Admiral Donitz read the reports with growing disbelief. 41 U-boats lost in a single month. The North Atlantic, once his greatest weapon, had turned into a graveyard. He summoned his officers to the war room, a map of the Atlantic covering the wall, dotted with red pins marking last known positions. The pins had begun to cluster ominously around the routes between Newfoundland and Iceland. "This is not coincidence," Donitz said, his voice cold. "Someone has learned our playbook." One of his aides suggested new sonar countermeasures. Another blamed the Luftwaffe's failure to provide air cover. But Donitz wasn't listening. He knew the truth was simpler. The Canadians had evolved faster than anyone expected. He dismissed the meeting in silence. The next morning, he sent a message to all U-boat captains. Beware the northern escorts. They no longer behave as amateurs. That reputation spread faster than propaganda. Survivors of sunken submarines spoke of phantom convoys, ships that attacked without sonar pings, that struck from silence and disappeared into fog. The myth terrified new recruits. Some claimed the Canadians could hear through metal. Others said their ships carried priests who blessed the water before battle. In truth, what they carried was something far more dangerous, intuition sharpened by suffering. The Snowberry's crew had lost too many friends to believe in luck. They had learned through repetition, through failure, through watching the sea swallow men whole. Each improvement came from necessity. A misaligned depth charge pattern adjusted, a sonar rhythm understood, a ship's engine vibration modified to confuse detection. Their greatest innovation wasn't mechanical, it was human. The ability to feel what the enemy felt, to anticipate the moment of panic, to imagine the other side of the war. At night, when the crew slept in shifts, the ship became almost tranquil. The engine's pulse mixed with the sound of waves, and in that rhythm, the men found a strange peace. MacLeod often stayed awake, staring at the stars through the bridge window. He thought of the men on the other side, German sailors his own age, trapped inside steel coffins hundreds of feet below. They weren't monsters, just reflections of himself, caught in the same indifferent sea. The longer the war dragged on, the harder it became to hate them. One evening, a lookout spotted wreckage drifting in the distance. MacLeod ordered the Snowberry closer. As the ship approached, they saw the remains of a life raft, burned, half-sunk, littered with debris. A single man clung to the edge, his uniform dark with oil, his face unrecognizable. When they hauled him aboard, they realized he was German, barely 20, trembling, eyes wide with disbelief. He expected to be shot. Instead, the crew wrapped him in blankets and gave him tea. He wept quietly, repeating "Danke" through chattering teeth. That moment haunted MacLeod more than any battle, because it wasn't hatred that filled him then. It was sorrow. He understood what the war had done to both sides, turned boys into ghosts, loyalty into survival. He wondered if the sea would remember their faces, or if it would wash them clean, leaving only the echo of their courage. By early June, the shift was undeniable. Allied convoys were crossing the Atlantic with record success. Losses plummeted. The Kriegsmarine's wolf packs had been reduced to scattered fragments. In London, Churchill called it the turning of the tide. But in Halifax, the Canadian sailors simply called it quiet, too quiet, because they knew silence in the Atlantic never lasted long. The Navy began assigning MacLeod to training duties, teaching new crews the techniques he'd helped develop. He hated leaving the sea, but he obeyed. In classrooms that smelled of chalk and tobacco, he spoke of sonar tactics, of decoy signals, of endurance. The recruits listened, but few understood what truly mattered. It wasn't the machines. It was the silence, the waiting, the intuition. If you want to find a submarine, he told them, listen to what isn't there. When he wasn't teaching, MacLeod walked the docks at night, watching the harbor lights shimmer on the water. Ships came and went, new corvettes, frigates, and destroyers, their hulls gleaming with fresh paint. Canada's Navy had grown from a handful of outdated vessels into a fleet of hundreds. The joke that Donitz once made, farm boys with toy ships, had turned into a prophecy he'd regret. The farmers had learned to hunt wolves. One evening, as MacLeod stood alone on Pier 21, a telegram arrived from Naval Command. Another U-boat had been captured, U-190, its crew surrendering off the coast of Newfoundland. When interrogated, the German captain said something that stuck with MacLeod for years. "It wasn't your weapons that defeated us," the man said. "It was your silence. We could hear the British. We could even hear the Americans, but you were the ocean itself." MacLeod never forgot those words, because in them, He recognized the strange poetry of their struggle. They hadn't conquered the sea, they had become part of it. And perhaps that was what victory truly meant in a war like this. Not triumph, but understanding. In the years after, when historians spoke of the Battle of the Atlantic, they often mentioned radar, code breaking, or aircraft patrols. Few remembered the men on the small corvettes, the ones who fought not for glory, but for endurance. Yet it was they who had turned the tide, not through invention or technology, but through the oldest weapon known to man, persistence. And as the Snowberry sat in harbor that summer, her hull rusting in patches, her crew disbanded to other ships, MacLeod walked her deck one last time. The sea was calm, the air heavy with the scent of salt and diesel. He touched the rail, cold beneath his hand, and listened to the faint sound of waves against the hull. It felt like a heartbeat, steady, eternal. The Germans had called them amateurs, the British had called them auxiliaries, but history, he thought, would remember them differently, as the men who listened to the ocean until it spoke back. Years later, when the war was over, and the sea once again belonged to merchants and fishermen, Arthur MacLeod returned to Nova Scotia. The docks were quiet now, lined with the hollow shells of ships that had once carried men into chaos. The HMCS Snowberry lay decommissioned, her paint flaking, her decks stripped of guns. Rust had crept over her like ivy, softening the hard edges of war. MacLeod stood on her bridge one last time, the gulls circling above, the wind carrying the faint smell of brine and oil, a scent that, to him, would forever mean survival. In his hand he held a small object, a piece of shrapnel from a depth charge, dull and heavy. It wasn't a trophy, it was a memory, a fragment of all the things the war had taken and given back. He ran his thumb across the jagged edge and thought of the faces, the boys who had laughed in the cold, the men who had vanished beneath the waves, the enemies who had become silent companions in the same indifferent sea. History, he knew, would not remember their names, but the ocean would. When veterans gathered in Halifax years later, they spoke not of victories, but of endurance. They remembered nights when the sky was so black that the horizon disappeared, and mornings when the sea turned red with dawn and oil. They remembered the fear, yes, but also the strange beauty of it, the way courage and exhaustion could coexist in the same heartbeat. And when they spoke of Berlin's mockery, of being called a navy of fishermen, they smiled, because in a way it had been true. They were fishermen, and they had hunted predators in the darkest waters of the earth. By the time the last of the Flower-class corvettes was scrapped, a quiet respect had settled over their legacy. The Battle of the Atlantic had claimed more lives than any other naval campaign in modern history, yet its victories were invisible, measured not in cities taken, but in convoys that arrived safely. The Canadians had been the thread that kept those lifelines intact. Their contribution wasn't loud or cinematic. It was patient, precise, and relentless, the kind of courage that never asked to be seen. In his old age, MacLeod rarely spoke of the war. When asked what it had taught him, he would pause, look toward the horizon and say, that the sea doesn't care who you are. It teaches everyone the same lesson, humility. And then he would fall silent, as if listening for something only he could hear. The echo of engines beneath the waves, the heartbeat of ships long gone, the whisper of the Atlantic closing over it all. On calm evenings, he would walk the shore and watch the sun sink into the water, its reflection trembling like memory. To anyone else, it was just the sea, but to him, it was a grave, a teacher, and a mirror. And when the wind rose, carrying the salt into his lungs, he would close his eyes and smile, because somewhere, deep beneath that endless surface, the ghosts of U-boats still slept, and the laughter of the men who had once been called a joke drifted quietly above them, carried forever by the tide.